Today on the Perception in Action podcast, Perception in Action Journal Club number 7. What is the most effective way to use cueing and focus of attention instructions for physical therapy and injury rehabilitation? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm joined by Nick Winkleman, Ali Golekar, Anna Benjaminza, Harjeev Singh, and Jed Dykvis to discuss the recent article comparing the effects of external focus of attention and continuous cognitive tasks on postural control in ACL reconstructed athletes, and the general topic of cueing in injury rehabilitation. We had a really wide-ranging discussion related to focus of attention research and translating it into clinical practice and sports coaching. Hope you enjoy. Okay, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Perception in Action Journal Club. Today, I'm joined by a nice full room of five other people, and our focus today is going to be on the issue of focus of attention and cueing as it pertains in particular to physical therapy and injury rehabilitation for athletes. So we're going to get into that topic. We're going to look briefly at a very recent study in this area, and then we're going to springboard it into kind of broader issues. I think this is a really important topic where we could make a lot of gains in this area. So before that, I want to go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves because there's some new people you may not know. We'll start next to me and on my screen is Jed. I'll let you introduce yourself.
All right, thank you, Rob, for the introduction, as well as the opportunity to speak with everyone, all these experts in the field. My background, I did a PhD in motor learning at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, particularly looking at training effects of attentional focus with respect to balance control. As part of that research, I got very interested in the underlying neural mechanisms, or basically why is this concept of external focus effective, and started getting into fMRI and looking at brain mechanisms underlying behavioral adaptations. Now I currently am a postdoc. I've transitioned a little bit to looking at the neuroplasticity, looking at underlying ACL injury prevention and ACL injury rehabilitation. So I use a lot of real-time biofeedback in conjunction with fMRI, EEG, those kind of techniques to ultimately develop ways to improve the retention and transfer of motor skills at Cincinnati Children's Hospital.
Oh, cool. That's really interesting. Nick, going across the top.
Yeah. So Nick Winkleman, I'm the head of athletic performance for Irish Rugby. So I work with our professional and our national teams. By trade, I'm a strength conditioning coach for the last 15 years. And many of the individuals on this call, of which the vast majority are heroes of mine in the motor learning space, I have an interest in coaching and communication and motor learning. So I got a PhD looking at the intersection of basically attentional focus and sprinting. And yeah, it's my pet project. It's the thing that wakes me up in the morning and keeps me up at night.
Oh, and the bottom right, Ali.
Hi, my name is Ali Golekar. My background is sports physiotherapy. And every time I run into problems with patients, I always ask myself the question how, why, and what? Why is it not going the way as I was expecting? And that got me into research. And this was initially as it started as a hobby, and it got a little bit out of control, and it ended up in a PhD. But anyway, I fell in love with research, but I always wanted that connection with the clinical field. So currently I'm doing my postdoc at the University of Paderborn at the Exercise Science and Neuroscience Unit. And we are primarily looking at motor learning, but also the behavioral and neural underpinnings, linking those aspects together in both in the fundamental research approach, but also in the translational research approach. That's sometimes that I feel is a little bit missing in our motor learning domain. How can we bring it to the field, to take it away from the lab to the field? So thanks for having me, and I hope I can contribute.
Oh, you're welcome. Very welcome. And the former podcast guest, Anna.
True. Hi, I'm Anna Benjaminse. My background is also in physical therapy, my bachelor's. Then with my master's, I went on to sports medicine. I got my PhD in human movement science. Currently, I'm a postdoc researcher here in Groningen in the Netherlands at the Department of Human Movement Science, and focusing on motor learning studies in youth female soccer girls, investigating the effects on different types of motor learning and how they move or transfer to the field. So the focus is really also to have the transfer investigated also. So I work on a daily basis with the youth athletes and trainers and coaches, trying to help them implement motor learning in their daily practice, but they also give me great input and give me good questions that we can work on.
Great. And last but not least, Harjeev.
Yeah, hey guys, pleasure to be here. My name is Harjeev. I'm currently a second-year PhD student at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, under Dr. Gabby Wolf. My background, actually, it started off with an ACL tear that got me into motor learning. I was just interested in how PTs were telling me what to do, and I would do it. So that whole aspect got me into motor learning. Got my master's in motor learning, and then took a couple years off, was in England for some time, and then came here. And I'm really interested in how these characteristics of instruction and feedback can actually, make a severe impact in optimizing motor learning.
Great. We got a nice interdisciplinary group here. Lots of different backgrounds and personal experience with ACL. So I'm going to put on the paper I said we wanted to quickly look at. I don't think we'll spend too much time on it because I don't think there's too much to it really. But I think it covers I picked it because it's very recent and it covers kind of the general issues. Is this one comparing the effects of external focus of attention and a continuous control task, cognitive task on postural control and ACL reconstruction athletes. And I thought what I would do is I'll try to give my brief summary of what they found, and maybe then just go around the room and get your kind of general thoughts about it, and anything you picked up or want to talk about, we can really take it anywhere. So what this, the point of this paper, and I think one we're going to focus on a lot today, is that an issue with recovering athletes is this internal focus of attention on, particular in this example, controlling posture, both because of their injury and maybe because of contributed to the way we do physical therapy. But what you see often is you get increased. For example, if you let them stand on one foot, make them stand on one foot, you get this increased sway in ACL recovery patients, which can be potentially dangerous because it could lead to re-injury. So the idea is to try to get them away from doing kind of internal focus, kind of conscious control of posture by adding some task to get their attention away from their body. So in this study, what they did was have the person stand on one leg on a wobbly board. They had both ACL recovery patients and non-injured control group. And they compared three things. They compared an external focus of attention condition in which the people were told to minimize the movement of the markers on the board, which is very analogous to a classic experiment by Gabby Wolf and colleagues, right, or balance studies. Then they had the second test was what they called a continuous cognitive control. Basically, it was doing math in your head. So while you were balancing, they gave you numbers. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it reminded me of the one I've used before, is where you have to count backwards by 3, something like that, right? So it's a distracting thing, so you can't think about balance. That's the idea. And then they had a no instruction control group, and basically they found. I'll put up the slide pattern, the results. There's a bunch of different results, but the main one that I think they want to sell is the one here. For sway, when you measure people's sway on the board, the continuous number counting, math in your head task, reduced sway relative to the control, which was no instructions, and relative to the external focus of instructions. And the control and the external were not different from each other. This was only true for the ACL patients. For healthy patients, there was no difference in any of the conditions for sway. There were some other findings, but that's the main one, I think. And from this, I think they want to argue and suggest that this kind of dual task, this cognitive control task, may be useful in therapy for helping people. They focus a lot on automation of posture. So getting yourself out of focusing on your own body and letting your posture be controlled automatically. So I think that's kind of what I took out of it. Obviously, there's some things we can poke out of it, and so maybe we'll go around the room and your thoughts or anything you want to focus on. So let's go. If we go in the reverse order, Harjeev, if there's any. I know I saw you post one comment on Twitter that jumped out at me right away about this paper.
Well, I think the paper was good in the sense that it kind of, taking more of the literature and applying it to the clinical sort of ECL population. I think that's very much needed. And I think maybe they could have potentially added a internal focus group to actually, compare the effects. Because I know from most studies also show that control and internal focus are relatively the same. But I think it would be nice to kind of see the actual, having a group that did IF. But I do agree with the whole dual task thing. I think that's where the sort of studies should be shifting now to more dual task interventions, because I think that is sort of appropriate in terms of representing rehab and return to play. But I think other than that, I think it was pretty spot on in terms of what they did. I enjoyed reading it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Anna?
I enjoyed reading it also. I agree with Harjeev, what he said in potentially they could have added a purely internal focus group. What I think is really important, though, to measure really motor learning is retention. And I think one important aspect method-wise in this study is that to really see the eventual results is that they should have added a retention test. I think that's an important aspect to say.
Ali?
Yeah, so luckily I had a couple of alternatives. So I come down to my number 3. No, I like the design, and I agree with Harjeev. I think adding a cognitive task helps us to understand attentional resources that athletes have. Not only in the acute phase where typically those kind of exercises are done, but also incorporated later on in some more complex motor tasks. The thing that I had a question about was the reason why they put the patients in a fully extended knee. And this is something that needs certain degree of freedom. And I was also wondering if adding the cognitive tag did not result actually in a freezing of the degrees of freedom. And subsequently, that may be seen as a reduced area of sway. And here I always have the question, what's the optimum of sway? How much adaptability do you need in your system? Because very stable does not mean you're very adaptable to changing conditions.
Nick, what do you? Good points. Yeah,
I think some great points. I really like the one on sway, especially as someone who works with athletes primarily. That ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment is essential. So, Ali, really good point. Just a couple things. The first thing is when we noticed that there was no difference across the healthy population, that didn't seem overly surprising. If you look at a couple of Gabby's early papers, notably the one on the acrobats, we know that the impact of attentional focus interacts with the difficulty of the task. And so in terms of the difficulty of the task for the healthy population, even had we added an internal focus, unless it was something hyper-constraining like focus on knee motion or something to that effect, we might not have seen a difference there as well. So that was kind of point one. The second point, and this is pedantic, but it's something that stood out to me, is technically they put a phone in the balance board that had kind of a level, and then they projected that level onto the screen. If you look at latency effects on phones compared to visual reaction time, I actually believe that, for me to trust that finding, I need to know if they controlled for latency period. I believe there's a strong argument that there could have actually been what they were seeing on the screen was a delay from what actually was happening on the board, which would completely explain why the external didn't work as well as the continuous cognitive task. So those were two additional things I thought of in reading.
Reacting,
Yeah, good points. Yeah. Jed?
These are all excellent points. I'm bringing up the rear here. Most of these have already been addressed. Nick's last one is actually the first one on my little sticky notes here. The potential delay, almost any type of real-time, or even arguments for real-time biofeedback systems aren't usually in real time. There's usually some sort of short delay. So in this case, there very plausibly could be a delay. Similarly, in defense of the potential null effects for an external focus, whether or not these are the right outcome measures to be looking at, these are all linear metrics of postural sway. There's some emergent research that more adaptive measures that are more prone to detecting, say, alterations in dynamic environments, say a sample entropy of a displacement or velocity time series, some sort of nonlinear metric may have picked out differences. Likewise, these are effectively looking at the balance board velocity and characteristics itself, not so much any sort of kinematics of the kinetic chain. So it's possible that we may have not seen changes there at the base or any changes in the balance board, but something could have occurred higher up, or say in knee kinematics, which is particularly relevant to ACLR. But then potentially, go on. Somebody was going to interject. No, sorry. So then another potential argument, and I shouldn't say an argument, another thing I'd like to discuss is that alternatively, instead of in defense of an external focus, is it also possible an external focus may just not have been as effective for this population? For instance, in Parkinson's disease, there's some research that you need an intact central nervous system for an external focus to be effective. Some of the work that Quincy Almeida, I believe the last name is showing that for those that have a central nervous system that isn't functioning properly, you need to elicit an internal focus to be effective. And I think that could be a way to springboard into the next part of this discussion, in which situations or when this external focus could be effective. But I think the paper itself, I love the idea of a dual task or some sort of additional, more real-world scenario. I think really adds a great contribution to the literature.
Yeah, I think those are great points. As you were saying, Jeff, they took most of my. When I read any paper like this, and you don't find an effective external focus of attention over something else, my immediate alarm bells go off. Right, it's one of the most replicated findings in motor learning. Not that it means it's wrong, but you should be digging deeper. I really the great points about all of them. The no instruction control condition and focus of attention experiments is always dodgy, right? Because you don't know what the people are doing. So it's always a challenge. It's really difficult if that's your only comparison. And I agree with Ali's point. Really got to me. I would have liked to see more analysis of the functionality of the movement, right? They mentioned, like you said, with freezing, they mentioned that actually reduction of sway can be the form of stiffening, right? They mentioned, which is not functional at all, right? It's not helpful. And so for that, related to that, I also, I always think external focus of attention cues have two things they benefit from. One is they pull you away so you can't disrupt automaticity or you're in control. But they also at the same time can direct you to useful information to control your impact. So it's not just, so the dual task is just distracting you, right? Whereas I think a really well-designed external focus of attention cue can do both, distract you and lead you to more useful things. And so I think there could be benefits from there. So I don't know, Jed, your point about, I don't know if we want to start there, when, or if we want, before we came on the air, we were talking about, the general issue of the problem of using internal cues in physical therapy. I don't know if in rehab, I don't know if we want to start there, or anyone want to have somewhere where they want to take this?
Well, I can start it because I'm particularly interested in those that have especially Nick with a lot of coaching experience and far more clinical experience, and Anna and Ali relative to myself. I think what's interesting, we talked about it before we went live, is that this, as you noted, Rob, in the scientific literature, the external focus is one of the most widely replicated findings out there, myself included. And 25 plus years of this research, you think this would be a common utilized technique in coaching and physical therapy. You think ESPN, every time somebody shoots a free throw, someone would say, use an external focus. You think it would be at least somewhat common. So with the Motor Learning Institute that Ali and Ann are doing in this new book by Nick, I think it's a huge and excellent idea to start transitioning what we see in the lab into what we can call the real world. And I guess my question is how well do we think all of these lab findings are going to translate to the real world, and what kind of generalizations we should make from these lab findings, and what you guys have seen anecdotally and with your own line of research?
I was building on that too. I think there's been a fair amount of work done on the coaching side of things. And, Nick's done a lot, but I think physical therapy poses some of its own unique challenges, right? In getting people to use extra. I'm walking in saying I have a problem with my knee, and you're asking the physician not to use the word knee. I know that's oversimplified, but Nick, kind of, what are your thoughts on kind of this issue of internal cueing in physical therapy?
Yeah, I think there's many different ways to look at this, but if we go right back to the beginning of the education of physical therapists as well as strength conditioning coaches, we just said it before we got on the call, that motor learning in some programs most certainly might dominate the curriculum, but in many, and I don't think I'm understanding this, it's a footnote. It might be one module within a course. It might be one course within an overall 4-year curriculum. By no means does it sit as a parallel track against all of the, let's say, hard skills. And what I mean by hard skills is in strength conditioning, that might be program design, exercise selection, physiology, biomechanics, anatomy, this visible, highly tangible curriculum that's part of what we do, where the coaching is a bit more invisible. It's the soft skill, many people call it, but equally, it's how we translate that what into the real world, yet it doesn't get nearly the amount of airtime in academic and coaching curriculums. And so I think we're at a point now where on the professional education side, so the work of Ali and Ann and myself and others, and Harjeev and Jed, what you guys do on social media as well, we're trying to put that information out there. But ultimately, it's going to have to be the academic institutions and the coach education curricula that actually start to bring this in and, as I say, elevate how we teach to the same level as what we teach, because this is a gap in the movement profession.
Yeah. Perhaps if I can add to this discussion, I feel that this discussion around internal and external focus is a little bit polarized at sometimes. The opponents and the supporters, and each camp will find their own arguments to build a case, just like you do in court. And I think you can always find evidence to substantiate what you're trying to bring across. But what I think is important to ask ourselves is, do we need to delineate the information we provide an athlete or a patient as to what the goal of the exercise is? And then I think the second point that is relevant is, what kind of instructions do you give during practice? And I think those are slightly different areas in their learning phase. And I discussed this with Gabi Wolf, because I got so many questions from from students like, so Ali, when we do an internal focus, are we doing it wrong? No, I would say no, you don't do it wrong. But I think there is this delineation of where you provide some information about what the goal of a certain exercise is, and then you have a choice. And I think I usually present it graphically. I said you have two flavors. You can stay on the explicit and internal focus, or now, and this is where it becomes difficult because you have to change habits now. Now you also have the flavor of using external focus instructions for your practice, because afterwards, and this is what Gabi Wolf also pointed out in her paper in 2016. She pointed out perfectly by saying, an external focus does not mean that your athlete is not aware of what he or she is doing.
Exactly.
So I think that's where some of the misconceptions, I think, have taken place, and where we probably speak in a different level of what we actually mean.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Harjeev, what about, you've looked at a lot of this literature, and obviously you work with Gabby, and maybe this relates to Jed's point about, do you think this really is a universal rule, the external focus, or are there possibly exceptions in situations? Maybe that's the wrong way. Maybe Ali's put it better. There's not exceptions. There's just different ways. We're talking about different things.
I think the crux of the problem is actually just understanding what external versus internal versus attention in general even is. Are we talking about execution versus preparation? There's like a couple of things that we have to really take into account, especially as clinicians and coaches. Also, are we? There's a lot. I think to answer your question, though, I think there's room for internal when it's not execution. Execution, that's when you go more external. I gave a talk at a volleyball conference, and I got the same questions as we usually do. When do we give? I mean, you can give internal cues when you're not actually performing, right? I can tell you what to fix and stuff like that. But once you're on like the court receiving a ball, for example, you got to be in that sort of external realm of things. And second, to Ollie's point, I think there's many internals or external cues that coaches have to really work with. I mean, it's not just a one cue fits all situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's multiple different external cues that you have to work with, and the issue then becomes is one doesn't work, therefore we don't believe in the literature anymore. So that's where like the issue is. I mean, I think there's room for internal, but it's not what the definition of the work that stems upon it. That's the problem, is that we don't know what it is, which kind of resonates through everything else. So once that's clear, I think it'll make its way to ESPN for sure.
Yeah. I agree. I think there could be a lot more subtlety and clarity in the definitions of a lot. I think, like, particularly people, I think like Keith Loesch and colleagues have done a great job in this and looking exactly when are you talking about focusing. And so I think that's kind of research helps as well. Any other thoughts on this kind of Jed?
Yeah, if you don't mind following up, I think Harjeev's points are great, and I kind of wanted to jump in with everyone. I know when I first introduced with Nick, it probably seemed like I was on a camp against Nick's book or not necessarily in supportive, but I think what's important for all of us as we start moving forward is to not necessarily make this about camps or a side where we're finding evidence to support an internal or support an external. We just go where the data shows us. And if we do this, we're going to find that in certain instances, what Harjeev is saying, maybe in a specific population, in this case, maybe an internal might be helpful if it's not during execution or whatever the case is. But as we all have backgrounds in this field, these nuances, I think, make it difficult to just implement into a physical therapy setting. So do you just tell every physical therapist, use an external focus all the time, this will work, you're good to go? And I think, and my guess is Nick's book probably helps, and you can probably elaborate on this. How do we actually get these nuances into physical therapy so we're using it effectively and not just trying to overgeneralize findings from, say, a large review where there's specific cases where it may not be as effective?
Right. Yeah, so, I've been a sports physiotherapist for 28 years or so now, and I can tell you from clinical perspective, if I would spend an hour and a half with my ACL patient and I would only use my one-liner, just like Archie said, with an external focus, it's not working.
Yep.
So exactly. I think we also need to take that science known findings from how certain external focus instructions have been given in experiments, but to translate that to the clinical situation. And those are different. And Nick, perhaps you can say something about that, how it is in coaching. It's a different context and it requires a different approach.
Yeah.
Nick, you want to jump in there? I think. Yeah.
For sure. So I think there's a couple really nice points in there. Ali, if I can start with your point. I first presented on attentional focus, I don't know when it was, 2008, 2009. And for probably a good 5-6 years, I presented the literature in what I felt was a pure, authentic way, which is overwhelming in favor of external. I do believe when we're dealing with a healthy nervous system, an external focus of attention, Harjeev, to your point, during execution is a principle of motor learning, and I'm going to need a lot of evidence to move me off that, and I think it's grounded in science. So let me start there. However, to Ali's point, I was getting all the questions. Well, Nick, are you saying we can never talk about the body? And even as I reflected, I'm like, well, hold on, I still talk about the body, but and Anna, you referred to it. It has to do with time. It's a temporal feature. And I've been putting up a graphic. It's probably one of the main ones from the book, not to promote the book, but I came to the same conclusion where there's this difference between a description of a movement and the cue of a movement. Yeah. And when I'm describing a movement, I'm trying to portray knowledge. And that, hey, I want you to understand what you're about to go through. I want to build self-efficacy, confidence. I want to lower perceived anxiety of what you're about to go in. So I'm building up knowledge structures, mental representation of the concept of the movement. But that's very different than the implicit representation of how to perform it. And so for me, I always talk about the cue is the last idea that goes in their head before they move. Ultimately, the cue is the focus we want them to adopt. Yeah. And so for me, the cue needs to be either an external or some analogy invoking an image in the mind. And so what I like about that approach is, one, Jed, to answer your question on my lived experience, that echoes over 15 years of strength and conditioning. And that I get the best of both worlds, but it's a temporal parameter, and that I give you the information about what I'm going to ask you to do. That's what. But then if I say you need to extend your hip, fast, slow, I just don't know. I still need to give you some kind of indication of how to pull it together into the environment. And that's where external focus of attention and analogy comes in. The final point I'd like to make is, obviously, and I said this on Twitter the other day, Jed, to your very point, not all studies have been done. I'm most certain that there are nuanced arenas. And absolutely, if we are dealing with people with compromised motor systems who do not have certain neural circuitry working, then that, from a context perspective, shifts us into a domain, to your very point, where an internal focus versus an external focus might come back into play. But I think if we look at Beck's work and a lot in the Parkinson's and stroke area, there is a lot of mixed findings on both sides of the fence. And it comes back to Ali's ultimate point and Harjeev's point. It's not always internal, external. It's about the right external. And many studies use very poor language that has, in my opinion, suffers ecological validity, meaning PTs and strength coaches would never use the cue. And for me, that's the defense of why it didn't work, not because internal was better.
Yeah, very good point, Nick. I totally agree.
Yeah, and maybe I can add something. What I was also missing in the study we're talking about is also the general instruction, telling the patients, okay, this is what you need to do, like Ali is saying, and that can have some internal cueing maybe also. But then indeed, when practicing, okay, then you have choices, but they need to know the purpose of the exercise. And when you're only talking about analogies and they just don't get what you want from them, it's kind of hard. We have done some practicals with a student a couple of weeks ago, and we wanted them to land softly. We used an analogy, well known, I guess. Okay, pretend you're landing on X. He was looking at us. He tried. He just couldn't do it, and he was like, "What are you talking about, X?" So we were here in a fitness room, and he just couldn't do it. And then we changed. Okay, your sound now on a scale from 1 to 10 is about 6, 7. Please try to reduce your sounds till like 2 or 3. And then all of a sudden it was like this, and he was able to do it. And in the
videotaped
studies,
that,
it was really fun and amazing to experience that, because in studies it's one sentence versus the other sentence versus the other sentence, and like Nick is saying, while coaching or while rehabbing, it's also the variety, what works and what doesn't work with one patient, but also during 1.5 hour of rehab, you just cannot work with the same sentence all over again.
And that's why Harjeev, I think the work, Harjeev, that you're doing, and you and I share a passion for linguistics. I spent more time studying linguistics when I wrote my book than anything else, because once you understand the structure of human language and verb use specifically, you start to realize that my push is your drive, is your punch. And as long as we become aware of that as clinicians and strength coaches, we can take the meaning of our cue, which might be spot on, and give it a new coat of paint to help that person understand. Because ultimately, it's usually not a failure of meaning, it's a failure of interpretation. And unfortunately, that comes through the lens of language if we're talking about instructions.
Yeah, sorry. Whenever I teach a course on motor learning, I always kick it off with a sentence. And it's a very generic sentence. And I just ask the students to count the number of the letter F's they see.
Oh,
and
yes,
and I only give them like 5 seconds, and then I ask them to raise your hand who's seen 1, 2, and typically they start raising hand with 3, and the right answer was 6. But my point is, my instruction or my question actually may not have been clear to all the students. So they may have given just a right answer because there's some social pressure, but also from a motor learning perspective, maybe if I would give some students 15 seconds time, they would have given the right answer. And that's sometimes going back to physical therapy where I'm from. What I see a lot of times is that they mistake actual performance and don't look at the long-term effects that we would usually measure with retention. In effect, when do actual learning effects take place? And they typically are a little bit too impatient to let motor learning take place. So what happens? Okay, I'm giving my external focus instructions because I've read something about it, and I've been working now on it for a week or 2 weeks, and it doesn't work. Patient doesn't improve.
Give it some time.
Give it some time, and also consider your language, because that's exactly. I totally agree with you, guys. The linguistics is very important.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience to you, Nick, in talking with coaches and things. You know, you present them these findings and how overwhelming it is, and sometimes you get skepticism about research in the practice applied side. I know those experiments are over controlled and fake. My point I always make is, even if you don't believe me, this body of research, the coaching and physical therapy have been so biased towards internal cueing. Why not just open up your toolkit and at least try this different thing of external cueing? All it can do is add to your tools. Yeah. Even if you don't believe it's better, which you should, but at least try and try changing, turn your hips to the ball to turn your belt to the ball. And see what happens. It can't hurt, right? So, so I think those are some good points there.
Jed, I'd like to ask you about Parkinson's and some of your points around the benefit of internal. And I find it to be a critically important area, and I have a passion for working in Parkinson's in the future. And because obviously it's a disease state that can be debilitating, and I think motor learning and obviously the use of dopaminergic drugs can be helpful. But when you talk about paradoxical Parkinson's, and in all the cases that I've come in contact with, seem to be it's the automaticity of movement. It's organizing the movement. If it's Michael J. Fox in terms of skating the ice, or the bicycle, or the stairs, or the differentiation on the ground with the lines, how do we rectify that with some of the findings possibly suggesting internal focus? And I'm thinking back to your earlier point, to bring it into daily life.
So I specifically don't do Parkinson's. I'm more interested in ACL reconstruction. I think Parkinson's, though, is a very unique population to look at this, particularly as I know all of you have probably read Gabby's optimal theory of motor learning, where the general purely theoretical component at this point is that there's this dopaminergic boost when using, say, motivational principles or even shifting your attention. However, the problem with Parkinson's is that dopamine is typically produced near the brainstem and the basal ganglia. And if that area is disrupted or it can't do this, providing that boost may not work. And again, I'm not saying it won't work, but it may not work as well. So that's why, at least in these studies, they show that if you provide somebody with dopamine medication that can restore the central nervous system component, then when you provide the external focus, it becomes beneficial because it engages those systems. What really all that means, at least to me, is that more research is needed, particularly as we translate into this real world. Some of the areas where external focus hasn't been replicating as well, which could be, to your point, might not be the best cues, whatever the case is, say even like gait or continuous tasks or in older adults. Sometimes these are populations where that central nervous system might not be functioning as well, so they cannot engage that sensory motor system or wherever they need to apply that. So ways to kind of get back to your question is to start doing research studies that better replicate the real world. And I think that would help a lot of coaches and translate that. A simple example is, say, for ACL reconstruction, you might do the drop vertical jump. So jump off a box, jump up, and you can look at your knee biomechanics. Plenty of people have shown just putting someone in virtual reality while they're doing this, so say a moving ball or defender, whatever the case is, your knee biomechanics are drastically different than if you're jumping without that virtual reality. So when you make the real world into play or put in those perceptual cognitive demands, it changes your biomechanics. But the research studies are typically done before that level of nuance. So I think doing studies that could easily show an external focus is very beneficial, which of course is the side I'm generally on, but just to try to find ways to bring that real world into the lab or find some middle ground to better understand that.
Mm-hmm. If I can just ask there, Jed, do you, as you look over the overall literature, do you feel it is skewed towards too lab and lacking, let's say, ecological validity in your experience?
Yeah, and I know there's no easy way. I mean, like I said, I've done this myself as well. There's no easy way to bring, say, the real world into the lab, but that's why I think a lot of the move towards virtual reality, augmented reality, say the Microsoft HoloLens, technologies that can simulate the real world a little bit better, I think would be a big component. And I think that would help at least coaches and practitioners translate this, because basically to your point, or I think Ali might have said it, is I can't just give them an external focus cue the whole time. Like we're talking and there's people walking around and there's music in the background. Like the world doesn't work like that. So they have a tough time bringing these dart throwing studies, say, to the real world. And I think all it requires from us is doing more research and better clarifying all this.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jed. That's one of the reasons why we finished our recently a pilot study. And the whole idea behind this is that we want to translate our fundamental research finding now to the clinical situation. So in short, what we've done is we've written a 6-week balance training program or postural stability training program for ACL patients, containing 3 sessions a week and including all the instructions. But the exercise programs were different from day to day, so in order to represent ecological valid conditions and also introducing variable practice, of course. But we wanted to have a program that typically reflects what happens in the daily clinic. Because if I give my patient 3 exercises for 6 weeks in the same order, it's not only the language as a confounder, but also the practice organization itself. So we have some preliminary results, and they look quite promising, where we randomized between external and internal. So they did exactly the same exercises, but the difference were the instructions. But I'll keep you posted once we've...
I'm excited to see it. I mean, I would still, of course, vote for an external focus. It's just more of a looking for more research like that. And I think to your point, I know, and you've done some of this as well, longer training studies I also think are particularly important, especially if we're talking with ACL reconstruction. As we know, it's a 9 to 12 month recovery, and we're extrapolating findings from 40 trials of balancing on a wobble board at 24-hour retention. As anyone knows that does neuromuscular training or any sort of long rehabilitation, this is weeks. And of course, it's easy to say, let's do a 10-week attentional focus study. It's a lot more complicated than that. And again, it's very possible, and I would believe that an external focus would be beneficial, but this could help that whether it's clinical trials or something that's longer, or exactly what Ali said, where we're replicating a more realistic paradigm and then doing that manipulation, I think would help alleviate PTs and coaches' concerns on whether this would transfer.
Yeah, I think just a couple things. I have my EndNote pulled up, and I don't want to speak from a clinical perspective, but there are 23 studies on jumping. There are 28 studies on running and sprinting, 22 on golf. There are 8 on soccer, 6 on tennis, 6 on I'm gonna disagree strongly that from the vast majority of the literature that it doesn't represent. These studies are done in oftentimes ecologically representative environments, i.e. a golf course. Individuals are given cues, especially if it's within subject, internal, external control. They're randomized. I love that because that's what coaches do. We try different cues out and see which ones work. So I think we need to be careful to brand the current external focus or attentional focus literature as not ecologically valid. Maybe for certain movements, certain contexts, most certainly, Jed, I would agree. But on the whole, from a movement perspective, I strongly disagree, and I want to be cautious of putting that narrative out there because I think there's far more ecological validity in this space than in many others in strength conditioning.
So I was referring to the clinical situation, Nick. So in ACL rehab,
of course, that's
you bring a good point.
Yeah, the broader, but we take the whole literature and good principles need to scale across context, population, skill level, and they do. And you hear the passion because I've spent over 15 years now educating people on this. We do not need to qualify internal language for people anymore. We need to show them where it goes in a temporal fashion. We need to show the role of internal. But for me, we need to be very cautious in suggesting that internal still has a dominant place in the focus while we move. I've yet to see evidence that will convince me otherwise.
I have a question from the listeners I wanted to pull in, and I think I'm not sure if this is exactly what the person is asking, but I think to me it relates to a little bit of one issue people have brought up with internal external is the stage, right? There's some evidence, I have a little bit of it. There's that, if you're really novice, internal is more appropriate. There's also disagreements of that. There's also this one I think is, I'll bring it in here. You could see it. Wondering what the current perspective is on the relationship between the use of an internal focus in early ACL rehab and the effect of this approach on motor cortex excitability. So the first part of it, I'm kind of reading as, do we do something different right when the person comes into the clinic and barely move versus when they are, maybe like the study I did when they were actually physically cleared by the doctor. And there was really no residual movement problems. It was just performance. Do we do something different? Should we be doing the same thing? And then I'm not sure about the motor, if anyone has comments about the motor excitability. Does anyone want to jump in on either of those?
I think to the first point, and I'll let all the brain experts do motor cortex, but in terms of the coming into, you just got hurt, coming into, I think, with pain and all that, just from personal experience, you're really focusing on your knee. That's what's happening. So it doesn't really make sense to me for PT to then kind of just put more sort of internal focus cues on the fact that I'm already thinking about it. So I think an external analogy sort of situation will just help me. I think again, those studies I think need to be done where you just come in, you just got hurt. What do you do? To your point, Rob, that your paper was spot on, but it did show after a certain amount of time. So the issue is now, what happens right when I come in for the first time? And I think that's where the education piece needs to be sort of really honed in on is I'm a physical therapy student. Okay. I'm probably being told that, a person comes in with an ACL injury. The first thing I do is, I might be wrong, but more so extension of the knee, right? But, there's that you're taught to do that. But then there's different ways to do that. There's how frequency effects, how many times. And I think that's one of the underrepresented parts in the literature is frequency. I think that's one thing that we don't really talk about because as coaches and clinicians, let's be honest, we like to talk a lot. So how does that actually affect the person? And then this aspect of coming into rehab with an injury, what am I focusing on, and then how am I focusing on it? I think those two have to be delineated as clinicians, which I think, with Nick's book, it's going to get there, but in literature-wise, there needs to be a lot more for that. So that's just...
Yeah.
If I can add, Arjun, there is a recent study that came out. I forgot the name. I can look it up later, share with you. But what they did, they randomized acute patients after an ACL reconstruction, one in the standard group with an internal focus, practicing quad sets. And the second group used an exercise game in which they had to follow a certain sequence of airplanes and they could score points. Basically, they did the same activity, which was to activate your quad. They measured the quad strength before the intervention and they measured it after the intervention. Both groups had exactly the same training dosage, so a very good point. But what they found was that the group that did the access gaming, and if you want to call this an external focus, leave it open, but they had significantly, and not only significantly, but also clinically relevant higher quad strength after the intervention compared to the control group. And I think what it does, going also to some psychological factors, which I'm not an expert in, but you are not focusing on your knee, you're doing an activity. Yeah. And I think that's a very strong tool that we have in our hands with the modern technology.
And that speaks to the whole, dynamical systems perspective, right? If we were to kind of talk about, going from the sort of motor learning theories, really representative design, making something more game-like or making something, that's another podcast for another day, but that's, it's right alongside that, which also needs to be considered. So,
What about Anna or Jed or Nick? Do you have any thoughts about this issue of kind of stage? How do you transition from early injury to late, immediately after injury to later recovery, or early in skill development? Any thoughts or experiences with that?
Well, I only wanted to add to Harjeev what I always tell my students when I teach is that Dusty Grooms has found that in those patients there's already increased activity in those brain areas, motor planning, sensory processing, or visual motor control. So like Harjeev saying, patient is coming in already focusing at the knee. So why would you, with an internal focus, even more focus at the knee? So and then even activate those areas probably even more. So it would be really nice to see some studies, maybe even brain studies, but to see what that does.
Just a quick point. I think one of also the misconceptions of internal external is that if I'm encouraging someone to, flex their hip, for example, I can still tell them to point their knee towards the wall because I'm not really telling them to concentrate on the hip per se. So I think there's certain things, especially in rehab, that we can kind of look at. And that was one of the main questions we brought up in class was, if I'm encouraging hip flexion, I don't tell them to concentrate on their hip, but another part of the body, is that the same thing? And that's another good question. I think, if I tell them to point their knee to the wall and I encourage hip flexion, I still consider it an external focus. So still needs to be doing it.
I think with this issue of stage, and maybe you could speak more to this, Nick, and Jed as well. One of the things we could take into account, right? External versus external is only one dimension, like as you said, right? Another big one is distance of the cue. Maybe you start really close to the body when someone's immediately recovered, and then you move it out as they get, and there's direction of the cue. So there's other things you can play with and change. It's not a binary choice, right? There's only one or the other. You can systematically change the use of external cues across stages of learning or across stages of recovery. So, Jed,
I'll just just a few small points. Number one, I think we have to go back to the literature and examine where internal language is a benefit. And we know that when we use internal language, that a couple things happen. One, there appears to be greater co-contraction around the joint. So if you were doing quad sets and you wanted local co-contraction at that area, and that was the logic behind, one could argue that an internal cue for activate the quad is better. At the same time, we know that there's greater EMG typically. Now, usually it comes in the form of arguably less efficiency, but still, if you want a greater EMG and greater co-contraction, it seems that an internal cue, if it was a very isolated activity, might be beneficial. But the points that I don't need to remake, everyone's already made quite nicely, is there's already such a focus on that area. It's decoupling them from the injury. Yeah. And I most notably know that, as everyone else does, that the knee or the hamstring person, even weeks, months after they're fully rehab, is grabbing the knee, grabbing the hamstring. So from a psychological perspective, like Ali, I'm not an expert in psychology, the decoupling of that from the injury, plus the benefit of the external focus, and then obviously everything we know around choking under pressure and how that might relate to this, I think that the evidence is clear that we, from a movement perspective, should be shifting them to an external focus as soon as possible. The other thing is, it's been brought up by everyone. I agree that the binary discussion of internal and external is not good enough at all. And Harjeev brings up a great point. I'll reference joints in relation to an external marker, a wall, the ground, all the time. And my lived experience is that it operates more like an external focus than, let's say, extending the hip. And so the way I outline it is narrow internal, joint or muscle, broad internal, limb movement, hybrid, singular point on body to environment, close external, and far external. I do believe, and I hope that the book, in part, taking that as, let's say, a zoomed-in view of the continuum, will allow richness in looking at the kind of internal or the kind of external, because I don't believe all internal cues are created equal, just like I don't believe all external cues are created equal.
Yep.
Jed, do you have anything you want to add in?
I'm not sure if anyone actually answered the end of Dave's question regarding motor cortex excitability. This is something that's always questioned me, and I think at least I have far less coaching experience, say, than Nick, but when you tell him this external focus stuff that I am a fan of, a lot of the questions I get is, well, how does that work, or why does that work? And you can go into the EMG, but remember, any sort of muscular activity is still driven from, say, a motor cortex, sending an action potential to the spinal cord. People want to know how this works and how do these co-contractions evolve. And unfortunately, for attentional focus, we don't know a lot right now. At least to David's specific point, we know they've done it with finger abduction, so by using transcranial magnetic stimulation, which generally, basically, it applies the magnetic stimulation to your motor cortex and looks at how the spinal cord innervates on a muscle during, say, an isometric contraction. But typically, these have been done with finger abduction, and we can see this elevated intercortical or heightened motor cortex excitability when participants adopt an internal focus. So we can basically shift this when people adopt an external focus. The challenge with a lot of that, and kind of to Dave's question, with respect to any, say, knee function, or as we know, a lot of TMS studies have shown this altered corticomotor excitability following ACL reconstruction. We don't necessarily know this as well with respect to attentional focus, mainly because, say, even the motor cortex itself has, say, what are called knee motor region versus finger motor regions. It's not quite as nuanced as just stimulating the entire motor cortex. But my assumption would be it would work very similar. The researcher's name is Kuhn, who's done this work with TMS. But I mean, new approaches. I know Ali and Anna have been using some EEG and some other techniques. Can't necessarily get at motor cortex excitability, but we can start getting at the surrounding regions that ultimately drive the motor cortex and ultimately push out that muscular response.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know of any work. Has there been work done that's manipulated focus of attention explicitly and looked at that? The motor,
there's ones in scientific reports. It's a finger abduction, so look at the muscle co-contraction is in response to magnetic stimulation. With respect to brain, some have done FNIRS, but that only gets at the blood response in basically the prefrontal and some parietal regions. But from, say, a whole brain, there's far less on that to actually know what's causing these changes, or at least contributing to the motor changes we see.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge. One of the challenges of understanding this area, and to your point, Nick, and everyone, that they're not all created equal. I think one of the reasons external cues are so effective is they have so many different possible benefits, right? The excitability, the not interrupting your coordination, like taking your marker, the directing to useful information. One of the I've been trying to tease apart is some types of external cues encourage self-organization, exploration, right? If you use it in the right way, you're not telling the person this is the technique, you're letting them explore. I know Gabby's talked about that idea as well.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
And maybe I can give an example, and you can argue whether it's an external focus or not, but what we use for our patients after an ACL reconstruction, for the same exercise that Dave was asking about, we use an EMG device, and it's presented as a tablet in front of the patient, and we measure the healthy side and the injured side, and you see the graph for the hamstrings and the quads. And then I can see that typically for the injured side, and then there's an equal contraction. So like what Nick was saying, there's a co-contraction, hamstrings and quads, equal activity. So what I can do with this software, I can lower one bar for the hamstrings, and I can increase the bar as a goal for the quad activity. And all I tell them, this is your goal. How they do it, I leave it totally open to them.
Yep.
And it's like, I think what Harji was also saying is going more towards the dynamic systems. I'm not telling them how to do it, but they figure it out themselves. And typically, when we look at compared to standard techniques, when I tell them extend your knee, whatever, they don't grasp it. And this is a concept that can easily grasp.
Yeah. And I'd love, in preparing to write the book, I got into your let's say historical, but then more recent motor control. And I'd love other individuals' thoughts on this. If we go into kind of this whole idea of internal models and these efference copies from an actual motor control perspective, I like to use the following example, and I do in the book, and that is if you're moving house and you walk up to a box and that box says pots and pans, your internal model of picking up a box of pots and pans is going to be something very heavy. And so we prepare to pick up that box. But if your partner, for whatever reason, packed that with pillowcases, all of a sudden you go to pick up that box and you shoot up. And how many times in physical therapy has someone come in with a blown out back, picking up the lightest thing possible? And so I use that example to suggest the following. And that is, I think we have pretty good evidence on the motor control side that we organize our movement in terms of these intended outcomes, in terms of these goals. Yeah. And so ultimately for me, if I tell you to squeeze your glute or extend your hip, yet you're performing a vertical jump, I'm giving competing goals. And that's why the attentional system, I believe, and I think there's evidence on reaction time and otherwise to show, is ultimately being confused. And so if you scrap the whole attentional focus literature, you go right on back to motor control. I believe the evidence for an external focus in a healthy nervous system exists right there.
I mean, when kids learn, they learn that way. And for some reason, we started, we changing that at some point and went to teach with an internal focus. But the natural way of learning is actually different.
And I think you bring up a good point. That's where you need, as Jed mentioned, more than nonlinear sort of analyses need to be done, because sometimes you just can't, see it or analyze it. And I think, this notion of variability, although, it's been in motor control for so long, it needs to be more so applied to the attentional focus literature now. There's only been sort of, I think, just a handful of papers, but there should be more with that. I was just on a call actually right before this on motor control and this idea of like redundancy and abundancy and equivalence and adaptation. And essentially, we are, like Nick mentioned, we are sort of wired to just to concentrate on that intended outcome. The problem is us as coaches and clinicians is we strip that away from you, and we're like, and sometimes if we look at more of the dynamical systems and self-organization realm of things, are we making these compensatory movements to aid in that certain goal, or are we making them for something else? And so I think just more needs to be done in motor control, for instance, in terms of attentional focus. And I think that will give us really good insight into that initial question on moving from, initial phases of rehab all the way to the end. So while there's been 25 years of research, and there's just so many more questions. It's exciting, and I'm super glad that Dr. Wolf started the optimal theory, because that's essentially what brought me all the way here was, there's not just attention, and I think that's sort of what needs to be really focused on now. And
mental part.
We can do that.
I'm constantly fighting. I don't want to call it a battle, but sometimes it feels like it. Certainly in the ACL field, it's like valgus is somewhat of the thing that needs to be avoided at all times. And my point is, don't treat or don't target valgus, but target what leads to valgus. That's a different approach, because even a healthy athlete needs to have some knee abduction when pivoting and making 180-degree turn. It's about how you control those loads. And this is where perhaps attentional focus or EF instructions may be helpful if you have more attentional resources available, because the movements are coordinated based on the constrained action hypothesis. That might help you as an athlete from a preventative standpoint to perceive what's going around the field and plan your actions accordingly, and don't use all the resources needed for your movements. And that's, if we believe the literature, that's what 90% of the therapists do by inducing an internal focus of attention. So, but this is not proven yet. So this is just an observation from my side.
Yeah. Great points there. And my view, I have a more ecological view of things. Motor learning is, I don't like internal cues, a lot of them, because they're overly prescriptive, right? Yeah. You can't refer to the body. You're telling the person how to move. You're encouraging low variability. And almost always internal cues go in hand with corrective feedback, right?
Exactly.
You didn't do this exactly the way I wanted. Yeah. And we talked about coaches talking too much. That's one of the things they do too much corrective feedback. I'd much rather you give external thing, let the person figure it out, like you're saying. Do however you want. Be variable, try different things. I
take a lot of educational psychology classes because I like this aspect of teaching and how we teach. And I think one of the main takeaways is these words like shouldn't, these words like you must. It's just, we don't think about it, but they are so detrimental to how we end up performing. I mean, more literature has to be done to show the evidence, but just from just teaching students and school teaching wise, that's the one thing they tell you is to avoid this sort of these types of words that I guess represent like power and stuff like that, which you don't want. So it's just a whole nother ballgame, but it's interesting.
We also did some studies kind of confirming that most people, maybe it's like 30-70% or something like that, but most people prefer to get feedback when they're doing well to kind of confirm, especially athletes, they know about how they move. So it's, we really want to help them and to talk much and when it doesn't go well, we want to help them, but try to hold back a little bit and try to wait and give them some positive feedback when it did go well. And then they can continue with that performance. It has many aspects.
That's what also my point was at the beginning, that just the external focus is not the golden recipe for all. It should be seen in a context and in a context in a learning environment. Working with athletes, working with patients consists also about aspects like self-control, autonomy, motivation, self-efficacy, and all other aspects that play a role in learning. So not just the instruction itself is the magic ball here.
Well, see, this is why this is so important, is because all of these little ingredients that we combine together to cook the meal that is learning movement are so underrepresented, which is why it's such an honor to be talking with all of you, because it is our job to venture forward and share this in practical ways with the world.
Yeah. So it looks like we've gone around the hour a bit, and I know we could probably talk about this all day, but I want to be conscious of people's time. So maybe if I want to go around the room and just any last thoughts you have, what we need to do to advance the clinical side of things, the research side of things, anything you pops in your head as a last thought. Jed, I'll let you go first this time, so people don't take them all.
No, I think everything, especially Ali and Nick ended this, are great. Working at finding ways, it's our duty to ultimately transfer this information to the real world per se, and whether that some of us think that might require a little more different research scenarios that could better represent, say, the real world. I know that's a hard term to ever represent, but I think any way we can better understand how what we do in the lab affects those either undergoing rehabilitation or in a sporting setting is highly influential.
Nick, do you have any?
You kind of did one before.
I said that. I think what you're doing now, Rob, notably, Rob, what you are doing and what we're all trying to do is just more of that.
Yeah. Anyway, Anna, do you have any?
I agree. I think it's good to bring research results to the field and to those who are working with athletes on a daily basis, and let them figure it out. Don't try to be smarter with than the body or brain of the athlete with too many explicit instructions. Let the body figure it out.
Here. Yeah. Beautiful.
Harjeev?
Well, considering I'm a student, I have so many things that we can do. But I'll just say a couple. I think the brain is definitely something we need to focus on, because by understanding what's happening in the brain, we can then sort of start understanding how to better develop practice conditions. So that's one thing. Another thing is this idea of frequency and distance need to be very much more analyzed. And I think at the end of the day, it is as researchers, it's our fault that we're getting all these arguments back. I think we need to just do a better job in terms of actually making this material, more applicable, and getting the information out there. So again, Nick's book, this podcast, the Motor Learning Institute, these are ways that we're doing it, which I think in the next couple of years we'll definitely see a shift. And I think my goal now is to bring this to ESPN. So it's gonna happen.
Jed laid down there.
Jed laid down there. I love it.
Ali, do you have a?
It's always the most difficult to say something useful at the end, but I would say, for sure, sharing the information that we know from research, but we must not forget the end user, whether it's the athlete, the coach, or the patient, and perhaps a qualitative research approach would also help in this respect. What do they think of it? What works for them? What doesn't work for them? And that's, I think, highly valuable information that we need to take back as researchers and design better approaches if there's something that doesn't work for their clinical setting. Mm-hmm. So I think then we have a good collaboration between the two fields.
Yeah,
that
good
would be
addition.
awesome.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I would say, bringing it back full circle to this paper, as a researcher, looking at these kind of outcomes like sway and, maybe angles when someone's jumping and recovering from injury, I'd really like to see an emphasis on, we talked about this, the functionality of these movements, right? Not all sway is bad, right? Looking at something like uncontrolled manifold analysis, something where you look at actually is this useful variability? Just trying to get rid of it at all variability and all is one of my main messages that no, that's bad, right? Bad thing to do. So,
podcast on variability.
But anyway, so thank you very much, everybody. That was really great, and everyone listening, we'll see you next time. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for the fun discussion, guys. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.